Well, congratulations. You've successfully navigated to your very first geometry video. I hope that you had a wonderful first day and are off to the best start to your school year that you've ever had. I am going to go through these definitions fairly quickly because almost all of them are words that you should have seen before. But keep in mind that your purpose for watching this video is to acquire the knowledge and skills that you need to be successful in moving forward. So if at any point you need to rewind the video so that there are things that you can make sure that you understand, then by all means either pause the video, rewind the video, write down notes in the margin if there are things that I say that don't make sense that you need to make sure that you ask me when you come to class the next time. So an acute angle, check your definitions that you pasted in during class. Make sure you have that as an angle whose measure is between 0 and 90 degrees. As far as a picture of what an acute angle would look like. There's what one would look like, but it is by no means the only acute angle out there. Adjacent angles, you should know, are two angles who have the same vertex. And this should say side, not size, but no common interior points. So when I think about adjacent angles, I think about two angles who are next door neighbors. Your property is adjacent to your neighbor's property. So these two angles are adjacent to each other because they're next to each other, but your property doesn't coincide with or run over into your neighbor's property, and nor does your neighbor's property run over into yours. They're next to each other, but they don't have anything in common. So I might say angle 1 and angle 2 are adjacent. They're neighbors, but they don't share anything. An angle consists of two different rays that have the same initial point. And again, I know I'm going rather quickly, but this should be review. Names that we're going to use in here for angles this year and that you should have seen and used before. We could call this angle B because angle B is the vertex. And I'm going to use that symbol to represent an angle. You could call this angle ABC. It might be called angle CBA. Notice that anytime I name the angle using 3 letters, the vertex is always in the middle. The other name, or the other way we might name an angle in here, is using a number. All 4 of those are different names for the same angle. An angle bisector is going to be a ray that divides an angle into 2 adjacent angles that are congruent to each other. So the word bisect means cut into 2 equal parts. An angle bisector would divide an angle into 2 equal parts. And the way that we're going to show that those parts are congruent is to mark them each using the same number of arcs in the picture. That brings us to the next one. An arc is just part of the circumference of a circle. So circumference goes all the way around the outside of the circle. An arc is simply going to be part of that circumference. Bisect, we said, means to cut something into 2 equal parts. It could be an angle bisector, in which case it would divide an angle into 2 equal angles. It could be a segment bisector that would divide a line segment into 2 equal segments. But the important thing that you know here is that a bisector is going to divide it into 2 equal parts. Circle is one of those things that we all know what it is, but when we start to think about and put forth a formal definition, it's kind of hard. So a circle, I'm going to say, is a set of points that are all equidistant from a given point. So what that definition is really saying is that if our given point is the center, then each and every one of those blue points on that circumference of the circle is the exact same distance from the center. Collinear points are simply points that lie on the same line. In this year in geometry, when we talk about lines, our lines are always going to be straight. So any points that lie on or lay on that line are all going to be collinear. So in this case, points A, B, C, and D are all collinear. Complementary angles are going to be 2 angles whose sum is 90 degrees. The way I know this angle is 90 degrees is because it's marked with the square. They're not necessarily congruent angles, but 2 angles who add up to 90 degrees. A dorky way I've heard of memorizing that is to complement a 90-year-old lady. You wouldn't compliment a 180-year-old lady because there is no such thing. Yeah, I know it's corny, it's dorky, but if it helps you remember, I'm all for it. Congruent means having the same size and shape. We might talk about congruent angles, congruent line segments, congruent triangles, but any two geometric figures that have the same size and shape, the word we use to describe that is congruent. So two congruent angles, because they have the same size and shape, would have to have the same measure. So if this guy measured, I don't know, say 50 degrees, and this guy had the same measure, 50 degrees, we could go ahead then and say that angle 1, or I'm going to call this angle A and angle B, we can say that angle A is congruent to angle B. And I guess I should have put up here the symbol that we're going to use to mean congruent is the equal sign with the squiggle over it. Congruent segments are going to be two segments then that have the same length. Remember when we talk about line segments, we name them by using endpoints. The way that we're going to show that two line segments are congruent is to make a little mark in each. So we would say here that line segment AB is congruent to line segment XY. Notice that in the picture these two don't necessarily look like they're congruent to each other, but because of the hash mark we've drawn in there, we understand that that picture is not drawn to scale. Coplanar points are going to be points that are on the same plane. I'm going to think about a plane as being a flat sheet of paper. The top of a desk, the ceiling, the floor, the roof of the building would be all good ways to think about planes. The coplanar points are points that are on the same plane. So because points A, B, and C are all on that same plane, we say that they're coplanar. The distance between 2 points is going to be the length of the line segment that joins them. So in other words, if these are my 2 points, X and Y, the length of that green line segment that joins them is going to be the distance between points X and Y. So in this case, we would say that the distance between points X and Y is 8 units long. Equal means having the same measure. We can talk about equality with respect to the length of line segments, angle measure, but anybody who has the same measure is equal. Equidistant means the same distance from 2 or more other objects, usually but not always points. To intersect means to have 1 or more points in common. So in other words, the point where those two intersect is that blue point right there. Length is the distance from one end of something to another. So if we talk about the length of this line segment, the length of line segment XY would really be the distance from point X to point Y. So the length of that might be 10 units long. A line is a geometrical object that's infinitely long in opposite directions. So that might be my line. It's made up of a number of different points. Maybe I'll call these A, B, C, and D, just for lack of something more original. The way that we're going to name a line is simply to name any 2 points on it. So we could call this line AB with the line symbol above those 2 points. We could call this line BC. We could call this line DA. We could call this line CB. And those would all be different names that represented that same exact line. Sometimes we'll name a line using a lowercase letter. And you should know and remember that those are all different ways to name the same line. A linear pair of angles are simply adjacent angles that are formed when lines intersect. So if I take my 2 lines that intersect right there, My adjacent or my linear pair of angles are going to be any two that are neighbors, any two that are right next to each other. So this guy right here is neighbors and buddies with that blue one right there. We would say that angles 1 and 2 are adjacent to each other. They're neighbors. They also form a linear pair of angles. All right, up at the top of the next page, measure of an angle is just the size of the angle. How many degrees are in it? So the measure of that angle would be 70 degrees. Midpoint is exactly what it sounds like. And again, these should all be reviewed, so I am going through this rather quickly. If this is my line segment XY, the midpoint is going to be the point that divides that into two congruent segments. And again, the way that I'm going to indicate that those two segments from X to M and from M to Y is congruent is to put the same hash mark in each. Obtuse angle, you should remember, is an angle whose degree measure is greater than 90 but less than 180. Opposite rays are going to be two rays that have the same starting point but extend in opposite directions. So that would be an example of opposite rays. All right, parallel lines. I have a typo in here. It should say lines that lie in the same plane that are the same distance apart over their entire length. So when I think about parallel lines, I think about the railroad tracks going on. They're in the same flat surface, the same flat sheet of paper, but they're the same distance apart over their entire length. So I'm going to say line M is parallel to, and those railroad tracks are going to be the symbol that we're going to use to represent parallel to, line N. And if you wanted to say that those two are parallel or indicate that those two are parallel to each other in the picture, we're going to do that by putting little arrows going in the same direction in our picture. Perpendicular lines, you should remember, are two lines that intersect to form right angles. And the way that we're going to indicate pictorially that these two are perpendicular is to use that little box. So I don't know, if these lines were called S and T, we would say that line S is perpendicular to line T. Remember that that little upside down T here means the word perpendicular. Perpendicular bisector is a line or any part of that line that cuts a line segment into two equal parts, and in doing so forms right angles. So if I want to start with a line segment here, a perpendicular bisector is going to, number one, divide that line segment into two equal parts, which I'm going to indicate with my two equal hashes. And it's also going to be perpendicular, which I'm going to indicate by putting my little right angle symbol in there. A plane, we said, remember, is a flat surface that's infinitely large. Think about a plane as being the top of a desk, the ceiling, the floor, the roof, a sheet of paper. We're going to name a plane by naming any 3 points on the plane. So I don't know, call these W, X, Y, and Z. We could call that plane X, Y, Z. We could call it plane Z, W, Y, but we're going to name it by using any 3 points on it. So name using any 3 points. A point is a precise location in space, usually represented with a dot and named with a capital letter. The radius of a circle is going to be the line segment that joins the center of that circle with any point on the circle. So if I go ahead and draw a picture or a sketch of a circle, and here's my circle, the radius is going to connect the center of that circle to any point on the circle. A ray is going to be any part of a line that consists of an initial point. So there's my initial point, and all points on that line extending in one direction. Names for a ray we need to talk about. If this is the end point at point A, and points B, C, and D are all on that ray, we have a lot of different names or a lot of different ways we can name that ray. We can call it ray AB. We can call it ray AC. We can call it ray AD. But the important thing to remember is that if point A is the initial point, then point A is always named first. Okay, last page. Right angle, you should remember, is an angle whose degree measure is always equal to 90 degrees, and we're going to indicate a right angle using the box. A segment or a line segment is going to be part of a line that consists of two endpoints, so I might call them X and Y, and all those points in between. To name a line segment, you're going to name it using its endpoints. So line segment XY and line segment YX are two different names for the same line segment. A segment bisector is going to be something that divides a line segment into two equal or two congruent parts. So maybe I'll call this guy WZ. A bisector is going to split it into two equal parts. So there's my two equal parts. So it might be a point that bisects it, might be a line that bisects it, a ray, a line segment. Skew is kind of a tricky word. When I think of skew, I always think about a box. So I'm going to take a minute here and sketch a box. Like parallel lines, skew lines don't intersect, but unlike parallel lines, skew lines are not in the same plane. So this guy here, this line here, and I don't know, this one here that runs along the front side of my box, those guys might be skew. They're never going to intersect, but we wouldn't call them parallel. A straight angle, you should recall, is an angle whose degree measure is equal to 180 degrees. Supplementary angles are going to be two angles whose sum is 180 degrees. So these guys here, we would say angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2, or in other words, the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180 degrees. An undefined term is a word that we don't formally give a definition for, such as point, line, and plane, but it's generally understood what they mean. The vertex of an angle is going to be the initial point of the two rays which form the angle. So that would be the vertex of that angle. And then the last one, vertical angles are going to be non-adjacent, so not neighbors, that are formed when two lines intersect. So two angles that are not neighbors are those two guys there that are exactly across from each other. And you should remember that vertical angles are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, or in other words, the measure of angle 1 is equal to the measure of angle 2. All right, so congratulations. You've successfully survived your very first geometry video. Hopefully there was a lot in there that was review. But again, if you need to, rewind and replay that video as many times as you need to so that you can get your brain wrapped around those vocab words, because they're going to be important to not only everything that we do in this first unit, but everything that we do for the remainder of the year. If you have questions, now would be a good time to jot them down so that you can remember to ask them the next time that you come to class.